All right, so as our second speaker in this pod, I'm going to call upon someone who's actually stuck in Boston. His name is Ben Novak. He was a graduate student of Hendricks and is a researcher at the Long Now Foundation. The Long Now Foundation is an organization that thinks deep thoughts about humanity's future. I believe it was started, Ben, is this true, by the legendary Stuart Brand?
Yes, Stuart Brand and his wife, Ryan Phelan.
Right, and he, Stuart Brand, for those of you who don't know in the audience, was the creator of the great counterculture Bible called the Whole Earth Catalog. And he has now begun a project that he calls Revive and Restore. And in order to introduce Ben and let him pick up the narrative, I do want to read one quote from Stuart Brand. He says, "The environmental and conservation movement have mired themselves in a tragic view of life. De-extinction is a wild scheme. It could be fun. It could improve things. And in any case, it does advance the story." This is Ben Novak from Boston.
Hello. All right, I hope everybody can hear me just fine. As he said, I'm Ben Novak, and I was actually part of TEDx de-extinction with Hendrik. I've worked with Hendrik before. Great talk by Hendrik, so thanks to him once again. And I'm about to get into my talk here about passenger pigeons, and you can see my title, Rewriting the Story, because de-extinction isn't just about rewriting the story of the future, it's really about discovering the past and blurring the lines where those two meet. So if we go ahead and advance to the next slide, you might be wondering what we're talking about. And so what is de-extinction of the passenger pigeon? And you may have a few questions. So go ahead and advance. Yeah, might ponder just a little bit what we're really in for. I get asked a lot of questions about this bird. If we go to the next slide, a lot of these questions are laced with the dismissal of the project or with forlorn for what could happen. But most often, people have no idea what bird I'm talking about. So I thought I'd open up today by talking a little bit about the real story of the passenger pigeon, and then a little bit about the technology we'll use to bring it back, and where that can go, because there are some crazy ideas that can sprout up from this. So if we go next, these are carrier pigeons, Homer pigeons, the pigeons that carried messages in World War II. They're not passenger pigeons, they're still around. Anybody can send a message with a carrier pigeon if they really want to. Email is a little faster. If we go next, we'll see a passenger pigeon. That's the bird we're talking about. It was endemic to North America, and I'll explain a little bit more about it. But why another pigeon? I mean, aren't pigeons what poop on your cars and make your life miserable living in the city? Those rats with wings, why another pigeon? And if we go next slide, I'd like to highlight some patterns of biodiversity, because I think nature tells us what we're really in for and what we need. So next slide, these are North American birds of prey. And I'm actually from North Dakota, the Badlands, where Theodore Roosevelt once had a cabin. And at any given point in the migratory year in North Dakota, you can actually witness all of these birds of prey in one spot. They all have very similar bodies. very similar lifestyles. A lot of them eat the same things and compete with each other. Yet, they all live in one spot. The plethora of biodiversity is actually what prompted Darwin's ideas. Why would there be so many creatures doing the same thing in the same area? And that birthed the field of ecology. It's that they're not all doing exactly the same thing. So if we go next, throughout the talk in the next slide, I'd like you to think a little bit about the peregrine falcon. And if you like peregrine falcons, then pay close attention. So next slide. Let's think about pigeons. And the first pigeon, so next, that's the mourning dove. Probably hear them cooing outside your window in the morning. And that is the range of the mourning dove. So it lives just about everywhere in southern Canada and North America. If we go next, that is the white-winged dove. You'll notice that now we have two pigeons living in Mexico. Next, that's the band-tailed pigeon. So the western wood pigeon specifically lives in trees, eats nuts. And if we go next, we have the ruddy ground dove, so another southern living bird. Next, that is the white-tipped dove. And next, that is another pigeon of the genus Patagynus, related to the band-tailed pigeon, a little rarer. And next is the zebra dove. And you'll notice that in Mexico and the southern United States, there are places in which you have up to 5 species of pigeon all living together. So why do we need another pigeon? Because in most places in the world exist many types of pigeons, but you'll notice one is missing. So if we go next, that's the passenger pigeon. So on every map you'll see, except for the mourning dove map, you'll see a large gap in the eastern United States and southern Ontario. That's where the passenger pigeon lived. What's interesting to note is the peregrine falcon is a pigeon specialist. It eats pigeons. And during the 60s, when DDT swept through, killed off birds of prey everywhere, there's only one place that the peregrine falcon actually went extinct, and that is the exact range on that map of the passenger pigeon. On the west coast it survived, in the south it survived, but where there were no passenger pigeons, it went extinct. Basically because there was no food. So next slide. Some questions become a little bit more loaded that people ask. They wonder, well, the passenger pigeon's been extinct a long time. Hasn't it been replaced? And I'm just going to go ahead and shake my head and say no. Because Hendrik will tell you, in terms of geological time, being extinct 100 years, which is this year, the passenger pigeon went extinct September 1st, 1914. 100 years is a blink. And sure, species have begun eating more acorns now because the passenger pigeon isn't competing with them, but there's nothing really replacing them. So if nothing's replaced them, why not put the band-tailed pigeon where the passenger pigeon goes? Certainly that would be easier than this cockamamie de-extinction stuff. Well, let's think about this question a little bit. So next slide. This is a map of North America, excluding the best part. I know Canada's not there. I'm sorry about that. I'm down in the United States, and we have a very, very United States-centric view of things. You'll notice we chopped off Mexico too. That's not fair because Mexico is quite literally our legs. And if we go next, you'll see the distribution ranges of the band-tailed pigeon on the west and the passenger pigeon of the east. There are 2 subspecies of band-tailed pigeon in the west. So that's where they live. And I want to remind you that at one point in time, there were 5 billion passenger pigeons in that blue area. And some people freak out. They go, well, that's a lot of pigeons. But I want to also specify that those billions of passenger pigeons were only about 2 or 3 flocks of birds. They were the largest flocks in history. Even though they inhabited through history that entire range, a flock of passenger pigeons would only be seen in one spot at a time. It might encompass as little as a few square miles of forest, which is a dot on the map. People would go a couple years in their town without seeing any because of the bird's nomadic nature. And then if we go next, by 1914, that pigeon was gone. But a new pigeon did come onto the scene. So next, the rock pigeon, the rat with wings, which is really unfair because not only are all of you descendants of the survivors of Black Plague, but show of hands, how many of you had a grandfather or great-grandfather in World War II? You're alive because of pigeons. I hate to say it, but look up the story of G.I. Joe. He's actually a pigeon. So the question is, if we go next, has the rock pigeon gone out of the cities and into the forest? Has the bandtail pigeon, if we go next, gone from its range through some of the habitable zones across the Great Plains, and has it colonized the forest? It's been 100 years. There are millions of rock pigeons. There are plenty of bandtail pigeons. But if we go next, in that entire time, not a single pigeon has colonized the forests of eastern North America. We still have mourning doves. We do have some invasions of collared doves, but none of those birds are doing what passenger pigeons do. Nature tells us we need pigeons. The future of the peregrine falcon living in the forests requires a type of pigeon. This is something that would benefit from having a pigeon. Why not put the band-tailed pigeon back? Well, there are certain characteristics about a passenger pigeon that have evolved over several 100,000 to million years to fit the eastern forests, and the band-tailed pigeon has fit the western forests, and that's just enough difference that it could make a relocation project pretty hard. The idea of de-extinction is to bring in those traits that the passenger pigeon advanced and help the process along. So we go next slide. Let's think about some better questions. Will the passenger pigeon survive? Well, the chestnut tree is gone. Will it have enough food? You might have heard that they needed giant flocks just to breed. Are they going to be able to find their mates, have some kids? That's actually how my parents met, up there. Got to bring a rose, got to wine and dine. Will they become a pest? There were billions of them. Well, if we go to the next slide, we have the virgin forests of North America in the 1600s. And we know that we've lost a lot of forest. But let's look at a graph next. Forests have actually been growing back for the past 80 years, and in many parts of New England, those forests are now at the same levels they were in the 1700s, some as far back as the 1600s. And if we go next, we'll see that present-day forest coverage, and we'll see just how many different types of tree species exist in those forests. These are diverse, rich forests, and they're on the rebound. Kind of rebound that could benefit with a passenger pigeon. Next slide. What do we know about passenger pigeons? Well, these are passenger pigeon fossils, and they date back up to 10,000 years. And if we go next, the oldest fossil of a passenger pigeon, that tiny chunk, I know it's not much, is 240,000 years old. Next. That means the passenger pigeon didn't just survive one ice age. Next, there's our cold pigeon. Next, it survived 2 major ice age periods. Next slide. And how did it do it? Well, a paper published on Monday has clarified part of that process. This is a population graph of the passenger pigeon based on genome-wide DNA. And it turns out that passenger pigeons boomed up to large populations and came back down to small populations multiple times with resources, the acorns of the forest. They can't outgrow the forest, but they can survive at really, really tough times. So you don't need 1 billion passenger pigeons. You may only need 100,000, maybe only 50,000. That's a pretty small number, actually, compared to how many other types of birds there are in the world. If you go to the next slide, you'll notice that a lot of chestnuts are a pretty hard pill to swallow when they're the size of your head. So the passenger pigeon clearly could eat some chestnuts, but in the dietary records, there is only one instance of a passenger pigeon known to have eaten a chestnut. Their primary diet are acorns. So even though we're missing chestnuts, we might be missing some other trees. What we're really tracking is oak abundance, beech, and of those up to 200 species of trees living in the forest, many of those are dietary items of the passenger pigeon. This is a bird that can come back. It actually defies logic that it went extinct because of its generalist nature. But the overharvest of the 1800s brought on by the industrial age was just too much to tip the scales. So if we go next, how are we going to do it? And if we just cycle next 3 times here, we're going to go from genomes to cells, next, cells to a bird, next, and the final animation here, a bird to a flock. That's really simple. How are we going to do it? Next slide. Well, first we're going to have the genome sequence. We compare it to the rock pigeon, all those little fragments of DNA. Next, we're going to make the final code. You'll notice a few differences. Well, we've learned from its DNA that the bandtail pigeon, next, is its closest relative. You'll notice there are fewer mutations there. We'll take this information, next slide, and we'll obtain some cells. So go ahead and keep cycling through the animations, because I'm running out of time. And it'll show you a little graphic of how we're going to take some cells, alter the breeding period of these birds, because we need some very special fibroblasts and germ cells to do our genome editing. And if we go to the next slide, once we have those germ cells in a petri dish, we're going to add in the DNA of the passenger pigeon through CRISPR technology. This is a genome editing technology that allows us to do fine-tuned precision editing, the kind that makes Jurassic Park possible if you could get dinosaur DNA. So if we keep going through the animations, it will show us how CRISPRs come in and edit DNA in a little animation here. And that plugs away, inserting new DNA that we make based on the passenger pigeon code. If we go to the next slide, after we get that DNA into the cells, whoever's running this can keep going through the animations. We're going to take those cells and put them into a bandtail pigeon. That's going to grow up to be a regular bandtail pigeon, but it will have the sperm or the eggs of a passenger pigeon. And when we breed 2 of those birds together, we will end up getting a passenger pigeon. This has been done with chicken sperm in ducks, chicken sperm in guinea fowl. This is not an unproven technology. And it's the kind of technology that's going to allow us to get around that cloning problem with birds and create these extinct birds. So next slide. What are the limitations of de-extinction? Next, well, they're based on how creative your ideas can get. Go ahead. Time matters. I need everyone to think about the limitations and the parameters we deal with. So next, this is the geological time scale. Next, that's the last couple million years, the Pleistocene where there's mammoths, the Holocene where there's Native Americans hunting down bison and cities rising up. Go next. Depending on where you're at in the world will depend on getting good DNA. So next, the cold regions of the world preserve DNA really well. Maybe you'll get DNA up to 1 million years old. Next, the temperate regions, it starts to break down more. But there have been DNA sequences up to 400,000 years old from Spain. But next, those really tropical regions might be a little more difficult to get old DNA. And without that old DNA, the idea of de-extinction starts to fall apart. So you might not get a 1 million-year-old animal from Brazil, but possibly from Siberia. Next slide. If you don't have the right relatives, twisting around a genome can be a little difficult. So here you can see a chicken and a crocodile, very different genomes. We go next. Well, there's a pheasant, a quail. Well, those genomes all start to look pretty similar. So turning one bird into another, well, that's quite doable. The closer your relative, you start to see that this is possible. If we go to the next slide, something people don't always think about is the mother that is going to carry this child. And if you're a mother out there, I think you'll get this quite right away. Those are giant sloths. And that tiny little orange guy is a living sloth. Yeah, I don't think I need to explain it. But recently, if we go next, people have been 3D printing organs. This is a 3D printed mouse kidney that actually works. So if we go next, maybe in the future, we can create some giant sloth cells, print a uterus. This is the kind of technology that would aid in emergency situations during pregnancy. Maybe someday a sloth can be born without having a mother. Next slide. What about going beyond this? What if we don't care about the exact animal, but we care about the ecological niche? So on the left here, you'll see macrauchenia, crazy looking animal, and there's a camel. Not really related, but could we mess around with genomes enough to restore the form of the macrauchenia and get it to do in the wild what it used to do? Well, this is a tapir, if we go next, and it has a little trunk. So maybe, if we go next, we steal some genes from the tapir, we give the camel a trunk, and next, wipe away a hump. Well, that's starting to look like something that could fit the ecological role of macrauchenia. Go to the next slide. What about T-Rex? What about dinosaurs? Well, if we go next, there is no dinosaur DNA. But what about that idea of reconstructing a genome just based on the idea, the concept? So if we go next, we have the chicken. It is a living dinosaur. Next, you'll see the chicken skeleton. And there are people out there working on ways to tweak the expression of genes in the chicken to make the chickenosaurus go next. It's vicious and ferocious. What might it look like in life? Let's go next. It's not quite T-Rex, I know. But if you look at that dinosaur on the left, hopefully you'll see two things on the bottom now. That guy on the left is an actual dinosaur, a type of raptor from the Mesozoic. So a chickenosaurus is kind of a dinosaur. But next slide. I'll just stick with my pigeons. With that, I'd like to end, and thank you very much for listening. The last slide, I'll be speaking about this project in more depth, talking about our data on September 26th at the Royal Ontario Museum. It's not advertised yet, but it's a ticketed event. I'd love to see some of you there. And be sure to follow the project at Revive and Restore's blog. Just get on Google, check things out. And if you're really interested in passenger pigeons, look up Project Passenger Pigeon with Joel Greenberg. He's really been spreading the story. Check out his book, and feel free to ask me questions later. Thank you very much.
So Ben, thank you for that. Your rationale for bringing back the passenger pigeon is that we humanity caused the extinction, therefore we have the moral obligation to bring it back. But what happens when we have herds of dinosaurs roaming our big cities and turning a Japanese horror movie into real life? And a supplementary question, a more serious one, is the practicalities. Ben, how far away are you from actually achieving a passenger pigeon?
Well, that's the question on everybody's mind. And what I can say is my motivation for a passenger pigeon really stems more from a conservation aspect. What is valuable to today's world and the future, and what will work with climate change as the world changes, and working with biodiversity. So I feel if we keep focusing on the idea of de-extinction through conservation, nature is going to point us in the right direction. We don't need to look at human history or moral obligations. We need to look at ecosystems and biological functions and let them be the guide. And I don't think dinosaurs are a fit. They've been gone for a very long time. And we already have 9,000 types of dinosaurs. I'm actually trying to bring one back. It's just not T-Rex. It's way better, way better. As far as practicality, we'll have a really good idea about the practicality when we're done completing the entire genome. So what was published on Monday by another team was a lot of genome sequences, 57% to 75%, but not the whole thing. We need the band-tailed pigeon genome to look at, and we're constructing that right now at the lab. I'm actually here in Santa Cruz with Dr. Beth Shapiro. She's the first person to sequence DNA from a passenger pigeon, only person to sequence DNA from a dodo bird, which is a giant pigeon. If you like dodos, then you like pigeons. But I grow a little more optimistic every few months with advances in technology and what we're learning. How close we are, I can't really say, but I've always given out the answer: if we have the money we need and things don't get set back, we might have a first generation of passenger pigeons in maybe 8 to 9 years from now, so 10 years total project time, and then we'll start trying to work with them in breeding. And that's based on how long it might take to do some of these really challenging steps.
Well, thanks very much, Ben. We'll have you back for our 25th anniversary.
That'd be great.